Hello and welcome to the fourth in the series of Biz Group's Industry Insights. Today I'm privileged to be with Dr. David Finnigan, MBA and MBE. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Matthew. Pleased to see you again.
Likewise. So for all of the viewers out here, Dave, as I'll speak to him throughout the course of this interview, is a little bit different, or has a little bit of a different background from the people we've connected with so far in the series. So Dave, with that in mind, would you like to give everyone context of who is Dr. David Finnigan?
Certainly. Yeah, my background is predominantly military. So I spent 25 years in the British Royal Air Force, flying helicopters, predominantly within the special operations field. I moved out to the UAE in 2012, where I worked as a consultant and trainer. And then I became an advisor for the UAE military, doing a very similar kind of role, advising, etc. As I said, my background is predominantly special operations. So I've had a lot of experience with crisis. I started life as an operator, just doing the job, and culminating, I was head of training and head of the deputy commander of a special forces unit in the UK. So I've seen the crisis management from seven different angles. One, actually doing it, and then also leading and commanding it. So I've seen it in different guises. I've also seen lots of different styles and different types of crisis. I've seen conventional war fighting. I've seen non-conventional war fighting. I've seen peacekeeping operations overseas and in the UK. And then I've seen natural reaction to disasters and then the usual home crisis, just the day-to-day run-of-the-mill crises. I've seen lots of it. I've been involved in lots of it, including hostage rescues, which is quite bizarre. So that's really given me the grounding and the understanding of what is a crisis, and in particular, how we behave in a crisis. And this is where my interest in behaviorism came in. Ultimately, a crisis is all about people, and it's understanding how people behave in a crisis. And that's really what makes the difference between somebody who can handle a crisis situation and somebody who basically falls apart and goes to pieces. And that's what started my interest. That's what got my doctoral research kicked off. That's what my research looked into, predominantly knowledge transfer culture, but invariably behaviorism, why people do what they do. And that's the angle that I bring to crisis leadership. You know, why do people behave the way they do in a crisis? Why do leaders behave the way they do when faced with a crisis? So that's pretty much my background and my approach to the subject.
And you've, with your own introduction there, you've actually introduced the kind of the topic for the conversation today, and where we're going a little bit further away from what I suppose you'd call your traditional L&D subjects, but actually something that's become incredibly relevant, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, as we've gone through something that we never planned to go through. And that's impacted everybody from children going through school to parents, to grandparents, to employees, to employers. And the nature of what we've all experienced, you cannot call it anything else than a crisis.
Correct.
And I'm curious, given where you started out your career, and taking COVID and taking corporate life to the side for a moment, how did they instill that belief structure, that skill set, that modus operatum, if that's the right expression, but that default response to allow you to cope with that through your military career?
I think to understand that, you need to look at what I believe is the crux of a crisis and the key part of a crisis. And invariably, a crisis is about unfamiliarity. It's about novel situations. It's about uncertainty. Yeah. It's about, from a leader, it's about having to make decisions without all the information. For an operator, it's about having to do a job that you may not be fully trained for, that you've got to adapt in circumstances that you're not familiar with, in situations that you're not comfortable with. You are invariably making decisions that are difficult, because, as I said, you haven't got the full information. You may have to rely on people that you wouldn't normally rely on. A lot of the issues I've seen with leaders is, classical, we call it micromanagement. The more demanding, the more difficult the task, it would appear there's more reliance on the leader to actually make decisions, etc. Whereas in reality, at the crisis, there comes a point where you've got to trust your people to get on and do the job. And the last thing they need, and I've experienced good and bad leaders in these situations, is that one person saying, so how's it going, Dave? How's it going, Dave? At that time, when you are right in the middle of doing something. And the last thing you need is somebody asking. So crisis comes in a million different guises, as you said. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the human being that is dealing with the crisis. And the human being, yes, we're all different, all varied, but there's a lot of similarities. And that's the part that I believe is key to the crisis. So with regard to coping with it, it's two things. One, it's about understanding yourself, your capabilities, how you deal with crisis. And invariably, that comes with knowledge and experience. And the experience comes from training. And for a leader, it's about knowing your people, knowing who you're working with, their capabilities, their strengths, and basically how they will behave in this unfamiliar, in this uncertain environment where things are not as they're expected. People start to behave in very, very strange ways. And I've seen lots of very, very strange behaviors. But what we do in the military is we train for it. So we train, we have this great cliche saying of train hard, fight easy. And it's right. And a lot of my team, I was the head of special ops training on the Chinook. And I spent a lot of my time pushing people into uncomfortable, I wouldn't say dangerous, but potentially dangerous areas. So bad weather, long hours, lack of information, difficult areas, difficult tactics, to push them and push them and push them, just so that they can get used to being in that uncomfortable position, but within a safe, controlled environment, so that any time when it goes wrong, we can extract during the training and we can do it safely. So that when it happens for real, then you just click into mode, you just put the tape in and you just carry on. If I can give you an example, Matt, we did a lot of flying in Norway. Yeah. And it wasn't necessarily because, we're expecting a war from the Arctic region. It was because the flying was so difficult, so technically difficult and so scary. And it made huge demands. And I remember, sat in one area hovering on 3 rocks because a snowstorm was going through for sort of 2 and 3 hours. And you just sit there and there's nothing you can do. And if you panicked, then invariably you'd fly into something. So you just sit there. We trained that regularly. When we went on operation, we're doing an operation, it was in Afghanistan, and we're coming over the mountains, and suddenly we went from being in the desert in the summer into this Arctic condition. And suddenly the cloud was dropping, the weather was turning bad, and we found ourselves in a snowstorm, and we just did exactly the same thing. We knew, we trained so that we could cope. Similarly, the leaders that we were dealing with then, they were also familiar with what we did. So that we just said, this is what we're doing, we're going to stay here, and we'll tell you when we're finished. And they were suitably trained that they could stop and say, yeah, I'm comfortable with that. And that's the big part, I believe.
And that's the piece I'd like to touch on. So one would assume and one would imagine that within a military culture and a military environment, it can be, well, by nature and by the way it's designed, it is quite autocratic. It's very much a case of you have your officers and you have your contributors, you have your military personnel. But how is feedback looked upon? Because fundamentally, when you are experiencing something as a team and as a dynamic, what is the approach to that sort of radical honesty or feedback, and what happens in these environments as you are training?
Yeah. That's a great misconception about the autocracy in the military. Yes, we have a rank system, and yes, the officers are deemed to make the decisions, etc. But there's also a concept called the strategic corporal. And the idea behind that is, again, it's based around mission command, that type of leadership, where the guy doing the job is empowered to do that job. He's trained and he does that job. And invariably, he's part of a team that has a hierarchy, but he is empowered to make that decision. And feedback is absolutely fundamental. And it's one of the things I see lacking a great deal in training exercises outside of the military. Our feedback was pretty harsh. It was completely, rank was irrelevant, because a 2-star general can kill you just as easily as a lance corporal can. So the feedback is almost brutal. And it has to be. It has to be, because it's about learning. That's where organizational learning comes from. It's about learning from the feedback. You don't get better if you just pat each other on the back and say you did a great job, when the reality was it was a complete disaster. You get better by being hypercritical and being feedback. To give you another example, I was fortunate enough to fly with the Red Arrows a few times. And I was quite staggered at just how brutal their feedback was. I watched them, I was in the display, I watched them after every evolution, just as we did after every training session, after every mission, you have a thorough debrief. And they put the video up, they showed the video, and I couldn't see any gaps anywhere in the flying that they were doing. And yet they were absolutely hyper critical about everything they did. Individually, and say, I was bad, I was high, I was low. And that's where you get better at it. And you build a bit of resilience to feedback. You can't start it, immediately going in and being harsh. You've got to build the trust. It's all built around trust. But feedback is where the development comes from, because it's through the feedback that you get the learning. And without it, you'll never learn.
And so shifting gears a little bit, and transitioning from the military environment into sort of corporate world, and the sort of the area we're going to have the majority of the conversation around today. What have you taken from your experience in the military and brought into the corporate development within crisis management, and how have you seen that evolve over the last 10 years? And actually, where have you seen the biggest resistance, I guess, within that transition?
There are quite a lot of parallels between the military and the commercial sector. The crises are different, but as you said in your introduction, there are many different forms of crisis. In the military, we go to the extremes with war fighting, but what we've just been through with COVID, what we're going through with COVID, what certain companies have had to go through, it's a simple thing. It's a crisis, and with the crisis, you get the same human behaviours. So you get the arousal of the limbic system, you get decisions having to be made with poor information. Conversely, you can have too much information. You get like a sea of information that makes decision making all the more difficult, because you've just got too much. That's the same everywhere. Similarly, when you've got people that have got to work remotely. So now you're looking at people working in a completely different environment. They're having to adjust to new ways of working. They're having to work from home. They're having to work with the families around them. They're having to mix that blend of, I'm a dad, I'm a father, but I'm doing the same job at the same time in the same house. That's a crisis for me. That's the difference now is that, crisis affects pretty much everybody, just in subtly different ways. The changes I've seen, there's a lot more information. There's a lot more research done into behaviorism, how we react in a crisis neurologically, because invariably it all happens in the head. So there's a lot more information about exactly what's happening during these different phases of crisis reaction. What I'm not seeing a great deal of is the actual hands-on.
Yeah.
I say it's the difference between reading about something and actually doing it. The whole experiential learning part. I've been involved in several crisis events, training events, and they range everything from a fire drill all the way to a full evacuation of a building, etc. Invariably, there are no surprises. Everyone knows it's camera, right? So it just becomes a bit of a nuisance, a bit of an inconvenience during the day. You know you've got to do it. Everything will be fine, and then you just get it over with. That's not really developed. We're not developing that learning. We're not putting people into stretch where they have to see how they react when suddenly they can't understand what people are saying to them. They can't quite hear properly what's happening. There's too much noise. They don't get into that unfamiliarity. It's still within the comfort zone. And for the leader, it's still very much within the comfort zone. And the resistance seems to be to push beyond that norm, to push into the realms of, almost into the danger area, to just push people, because they will react differently. They will, we've done some training that has been a bit more realistic, and people do react differently. And some people are very uncomfortable with it. Better to find out then when we can stop and we can say, well, this is exactly why you feel like this. Again, knowledge dispels fear. So if you understand what's going on, if you understand why suddenly you're getting nervous, why you're getting excited, why you seem incapable of making a decision, if you understand why, then it's all the easier. But me telling you will never do it. You've got to, and that bit I've not seen.
And that's I suppose where, again, if I put myself through the theory of it, I suppose the biggest challenge that you've articulated there becomes the emotional quotient of going, okay, all of your most powerful memories in your life, I bet you can almost guarantee that people can tell you how they felt.
Totally. Yeah.
And versus when you are in a classroom, or you are going through a theoretical exercise, or you're going through a fairly low stakes drill of going, well, if you don't feel emotionally connected in that, how can you possibly expect them to really, A, take it seriously, or remember the essence of what was trying to come across?
Absolutely. And when we think about memory, and there's a lot more research done about memory and how we remember, and there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that emotions and, we remember feelings far more than we remember visual cues, etc., etc. So again, if you feel that, if you feel that, wow, that really scared me. Why did that scare me? Or what was missing? I was missing some form of communication. I was really annoyed and frustrated because the boss kept constantly asking me how I was. How's it going? What are we doing? Converse for a leader. Why did the guys all looked at me like, I've done something horribly wrong. I was only trying to help. Why did it not work? Unless you get that emotional attachment, as you rightly say, then the learning, you're struggling with the learning. It's difficult to get that learning achieved. So, yeah, it's the emotional tie that is the key to the memory part.
I was told something early on in my career, and I can't remember what the context for it, whether it's sales or leadership or what, but it's stuck with me. And it's that simple expression is, people will often forget what you say, but they will never forget how you made them feel.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, that becomes the trainer's challenge, is going, how do you connect the emotional memory to what is going on? And I imagine that the biggest challenge with trying to simulate something in crisis, where you are trying to allow people to become used to the emotions that they will experience in a crisis, the only way to simulate that is to almost put them into that environment, which has some fairly obvious challenges associated to it.
It does, and it comes with risk at all stages. So it comes for risk for the individuals, it comes from risk for the leader, and cost as well if you're not careful.
Yeah.
If it goes wrong, then it clearly there's a cost to be had. It's the benefits of the learning. It's finding a way that you can generate that emotional tie and achieve the benefits. And the benefits are remembering how you felt.
I mean, outside of the topic that we're about to move on to, what have been the particularly creative ways, agnostic of cost for a moment, that you've seen crisis be trained in the past that have actually had a really compelling experience? And actually, even allowing for cost, what you've seen that cost reward look like?
Yeah, I've seen, again, I've not seen a great deal outside of the military. probably because I've not really looked that closely, but certainly within the military, we are just, the aim is not to replicate the crisis. So if I say take firefighters. So if I want to teach someone to put out a fire, I can teach them to put out a fire. I can show them lots of different ways to put out lots of different fires. When it comes to the actual crisis event, so when the firefighter gets there, that's a skill he's already got. The hippocampus kicks in. He then starts to put out the fire as he's trained. The emotional aspects, the external noises, those external factors that make it the crisis, that bring in the unfamiliarity. What is happening? It's an unfamiliar building. This is unfamiliar. That's the bit that's difficult to replicate. So what we try to do is you try to focus on a key area. And it may be something like communication is a classic one. Communication is always a challenge in any crisis. And it's probably one of the ones that gets the least attention paid to it. Again, outside of what we used to do. People think it will just work. You know, give me a radio, give me a mobile phone, and I'll just talk, and then that'll work fine. They don't appreciate that when people are doing that, they're not listening. The language that is used is different depending who you're speaking to, who you're talking to. And did he say this? Did he say that? Did she mean this? Did she mean that? What does she want me to do now? Why has this person not done what I've just told them to do? And I thought I was perfectly clear. So on the training side, rather than try to replicate a crisis, so you take into a corporate sector and you have a complete shutdown on all systems, you may want to focus on an element of that and say, right, how are they going to feel if they lose the ability to do this? So it's not going to grind the whole business, bring the whole business to a standstill, but you're certainly going to impact a certain part and a certain group of them. And then you can really focus and you can push those people into that kind of red danger area. But again, it's about understanding what you're looking for, and it's about training those key elements. You're not trying to create the whole crisis event. You're trying to teach people how to cope with this uncertainty and this unfamiliarity. I've seen a couple of exercises. I've seen a few people that have worked on communication exercises where they use different techniques such as blindfolding people to try to install the communication. That works quite nicely, especially if there's things like trip hazards, because now you suddenly add an element of, oh, I might trip, I might.
Who signed the waiver for that one?
They're good, they're okay, but they're not fully immersive. So it's they're too late. It's a bit like simulators. Aircraft simulators are great for replicating certain things, but at the end of the day, you've always got the big red stop button, so you'll never get that next stage.
Yeah, I suppose, and that's the simulated piece is wonderful for training that muscle memory of, okay, you want your body to do certain things. The challenge becomes when it's not the norm and when it's not the consistent, that you can't just default into what you've physically been trained to do. And I wonder, so as a subject matter expert in crisis and somebody that's recently completed your doctorate, what was it about virtual reality and sort of what we're going to talk about in the second part of the conversation that really initially piqued your interest?
For me, virtual reality, from a training perspective, from a learning perspective, just gave me full control over this emotional aspect. So I could put people into this emotional position where I could put them into these red areas within the safety parameters, perfectly safe, but I could push people. And it was the immersive quality of virtual reality that really brought it home to me. Because very quickly, you forget where you are. Very quickly, you forget who you are. You're in a completely different world. When I first saw it, I was skeptical because I thought, well, I'm going to be I'm going to be in this spaceship. I'm an alien. I've got no legs. How on earth can this possibly? Within 2 or 3 minutes, I'd completely forgotten all about that. I was totally focused on what I was doing, and I was removed from reality. And all those factors. I approached it from a experienced virtual reality from a leadership perspective, and very quickly the crisis element came to mind. All those elements that I see, we're trying to replicate during crisis training was all there. You've got all the pressures, you've got the communication, you've got the pressure of time, you've got the pressure of quality, you've got the different voices, you've got things happening around you. But it's that immersiveness that really, really brings it home. And that was the thing that I saw, when I first started to use it, I thought that this is a whole new level. And what I really enjoyed was I could kind of isolate key elements within the experience. So I could isolate key elements like the leadership part, communication. I mentioned communication, decision-making. I could isolate them and see how people made decisions. And then from a learning perspective, if I put my training head on, I could then come back out and then kind of talk through people. And because they'd done it, because they'd immersed themselves in it, they'd faced it, it was there for everybody to see. So it just really worked. But
I want to touch on something, and forgive me for interrupting you, Dave, but there was a word you used, and it was something that resonated for me because I felt exactly the same thing. And it was this, and actually I think it's going to be something that anyone that listens to this conversation, anyone that starts considering virtual reality as a viable solution to help their business is going to be faced with. And it's that word skepticism.
Yeah.
Why, I mean, again, before you went through it, why do you think you felt such skepticism towards the idea of going into a VR environment?
I think it was because I saw it, maybe it's a little bit gimmicky. Yeah, it might be a little bit, yeah, it's a new thing. Great. What I found from a learning perspective, was the things I couldn't do. And suddenly I found myself in that position where I can't do this. Why can't I do this? And there's nowhere to hide. I can't admit to it. I can't deny it. It's, I've got to pick this up. I've got to pick this up. I've got to put two together, then put it in here. And I can't do it. Why can I not do it? I can't understand this. Why can I not understand? Why is all this noise happening? And suddenly I find myself thinking, wow, I am now in an area that I'm not used to being in. I'm used to being very much in control of my destiny, very much in control of what goes on around me. Suddenly I wasn't. And welcome to crisis. Suddenly you're not in control. And it's like, wow, this is quite scary. And then I felt the actual feelings. So, I went in there thinking, yeah, this will be a game and we'll play this. Very quickly, I realized that actually, all these emotions, all this learning, I'm experiencing it. My heart rate's up. I feel kind of ashamed. From a face-saving perspective, there's other senior managers around, and I'm making a complete fool of myself, potentially. Yeah. But then when we came out, you realise, actually, you didn't make a fool of yourself at all. You didn't lose face because everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody's experienced the same problems, but you're learning. So the skepticism part was, I thought it was maybe a gimmick. The reality was quite the opposite. It really did enable that experiential learning to take place. And it's those subliminal messages, those subliminal elements, such as, the face saving. That, goodness me, I feel quite ashamed now that, I made a mistake. I've let the team down. And I'm a little robot with two funny arms, and yet I still feel exactly that. So those emotions that we're trying to bring out in training, and I can remember the exercise first time I did it. I can remember it today. I can remember how I felt. I can even remember when I dropped the welding piece, and I couldn't pick it up, and I could hear the clock going down, and I can still remember how I felt at the time, thinking, "Oh, life, am I?" And again, as I keep saying, from a learning perspective, leaders have to realise that they don't always have the answers, and they will make mistakes.
So just to give you and give the guys part of this context for what we're talking about, Jensen have built a world first in a multiplayer, multi-environment leadership development solution called Apollo. And what you've been describing, and as you've been describing, it has made me smile, because I have the same response. I can remember 2 years ago exactly the same emotions that I felt going into that as a what I would like to say an experienced leader. I have never acknowledged some of my personal failings, and one of the things that my team will tell you is I'm pretty single-minded when it comes to certain situations, and that comes to the fore every single time that I'm involved in a particularly high pressure, client driven exercise. Now, call it a crisis, call it a project, call it whatever you might, but there are emotions that go through that make me default to type, where all of a sudden I will go into tunnel vision mode, and if people don't keep up, well, get out the way. And that's exactly the same thing that happened to me in Apollo, where all of a sudden I started to figure out what was supposed to happen, started trying to reach out, and people inevitably, like you described, were so engrossed in what they were experiencing themselves, they didn't respond. So I went back into that tunnel vision mode, and it was that moment of coming out of it for the first time and being able to have that discussion and realization of going, oh, so that's what it's like. and
I think that's a really key part when we talk about emotions, that everybody has. When I came out, we debriefed it, because it's so different. So at first, skepticism, why am I going as an alien on a spaceship? Well, actually, the reality is that because it's totally different for everybody, everybody's on the same, nobody has an advantage. So during the debrief, suddenly everybody's, well, I felt that as well. Yeah, I did as well. Yeah, did you feel silly? God, I felt so stupid. I couldn't pick this up, I couldn't do this. And everybody's having the same emotions. And then suddenly you realize that actually it's okay to nonce. It's okay to be nervous. It's okay to kind of say, I didn't want to start this until I heard somebody else had done it. But actually, I could have done it. And actually what you said, I was thinking, and I'm a little bit underconfident, and you're, at the start, you're really loud and you're talking over everybody. And yet the reality is that I did better than you. And there's so many of these human dynamics that are brought out during the whole exercise.
So there's a question I want to ask you in that space, because as somebody that's spent so many years in crisis management and transitioned from sort of the military background into the corporate sector, there is this default response to thinking that when you're training crisis management through VR and using VR environments, that you have to replicate the real environment. And I'm curious, based on what you've been describing, how you've seen and how you would see Apollo be used in that space.
Yeah, I think there's two things. The first thing is you will never replicate a crisis for real, because you will never get that emotion. You will never get that emotion. As I say, you can ring the fire bell at work and everybody can kind of remember that they're meant to leave their desks immediately, use the phone, but everybody finishes the phone, they finish the thing, they'll grab the quick cup of tea and they'll walk out. And you've done exactly, you've gone through your business continuity piece, you've gone through your crisis response sector, and you've done everything that you said you would do, and everybody's ticked it as great. That's not reality. The reality, and you can practice that quite easily. And you can do that in a classroom, you can do that on a piece of paper, because all you're doing is you're just going through pretty straightforward motions. The thing you can't is the emotional side. And I think the beauty of Apollo and the beauty of the virtual reality, that the whole system, is that it takes you away from reality. And I think that stepping away puts you into that emotional world. And that is then when the learning takes place. And as I said, for me, crisis is about behavior. Behavior is about human response. And the training is how people will respond to the crisis, whatever crisis that may be. With Apollo, with VR, you can bring those elements out. You can bring that in a short period of time. You can bring all those emotions out, and you can focus on key ones, but you put people into quite a heightened emotional state, and you can see people behaving as you want to see them behave in a crisis. And from a leader observing his people, you can see that, wow, this person who's the quietest person in the office, when the chips are down, he or she really comes to the front, and they are, the people to go to. Whereas this person who's the one I thought would be the go-to person, should something go wrong, it is actually kind of falls apart a little bit. And then you do the training, then you train those people and you build up the skills. But I would say it's probably essential that the scenario with Apollo is separated from a realistic scenario, purely because if it isn't, people will focus on, if it was done a fire drill, and you had a fire officer or a health and safety person there, they would focus purely on that, and they would spend all their time trying to get into their fire safety comfort zone just to get into there. That's not what you want. That's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to stimulate that emotion. And as I say, being separate, having a different scenario really does it focuses in on that emotional state.
I remember in one of our conversations, you'd said one of the biggest aha moments for you was not actually when you were in VR, but when you were playing one of the other roles. And just for those who might not be familiar with what the caveats to this is, Apollo actually introduces you into three environments. One is the players themselves who are in the virtual world. You have your controllers who are in a control room environment, and then you have your observers. And for you, you had a number of those emotions as you went into the experience and were on the front line, as it were. But it wasn't until you switched into some of the other roles that you suddenly start seeing so many of the other synergies within crisis principles.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you say, the control room area is, for me, is probably one of the key takeaways from my background. So looking at, if you're looking to control a crisis, there are so many key elements, particularly the remoteness. Now we're all working remotely because of COVID. So just that remote working, how you deal with people, and it's simple things. People don't hear you because they're busy. People can't tell what you're saying. People are calling different items, different names. So are you talking about this? Are you talking about this? All these different elements that, I've worked in control rooms in the military for many crises and many events, and it's exactly the same. I sat there watching this, and it's exactly the same. You've got the four individuals. You can see what they're doing. You can speak to them. You can help them if you can work out how to help them. You can hear them talking. You get that full dimension, that full too much information, not giving enough information. And when you're in it, when you're operating it, yes, you're immersed in it. When you're controlling it, you are equally immersed, but at a different level. So now, from a leadership command perspective, I apart from the real thing, I've not seen anything that's replicated that to the degree that it did, because you bring in those human things, like, I want you to do this, and you've not done it. Why did you not do it? Or why did you do this and not this when I told you to? People don't do what you say. People don't hear. People don't understand you. That's reality. And you've got to look at different ways. You've got to look at different ways of phrasing it. And then when you step outside and you debrief and you feedback and you say, well, what? I told you what to do. Yeah, you said this. Yeah, I did, but I meant that. Well, you didn't say that. To do that in real life is, to simulate that in a classic crisis event is very, very difficult, because people will invariably do what they say because they're not in this emotional state. The clock ticking down, the clock getting louder and louder and getting faster and faster, it raises people's emotions. People start to get panicky, and that suddenly they stop listening. They focus on themselves. They forget they're part of a team and they focus on their task. That's the kind of thing that it really, really drives home.
Well, thank you for everything you shared with us, David. I really appreciate your time.
It's okay.
Any final thoughts and I suppose in terms of if somebody was to start the conversation with one of their peers or one of their colleagues within their organization that allows them to take that step, if you were to give them a single piece of advice or a single question to ask somebody within either their crisis team or their wider leadership team, because fundamentally Apollo is not just for crisis, it is for creating consistent behaviors and giving people that ability to practice. If you were to give them that single piece of advice to start the conversation, what do you think that would be?
I would tell them to go for this, to go for the experience, to try it, to see how their people will behave, to see how you'll behave, to see whether you're a micromanager, whether you're the guy who steps back and just lets people get on and do it, and also to test out your systems. You know, if you've got a business continuity plan, if you've got a crisis management plan, does it work? Look, again, focus on these communication, focus on these issues, and do they actually work when people are in this heightened emotional state? And I wish I had access to this in my time in the military. I would involve it in every office. I know the military are using virtual reality now in their leadership training for exactly the reasons we talked about. You can safely, economically put people into a situation that you wouldn't normally for obvious reasons, and you will see how they behave. The immersive quality of the system is so good that people suddenly forget that they don't have legs and they seem to be floating, and all those elements are teased out. And yeah, I'd advise everyone to go for it.
Well, Dr. David Finnigan, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Matthew.